Ever since I was a young boy, I have been a huge fan of the James Bond franchise. Why do I like it? Well, I think that perfectly explains why I like it so much. Bond is a series that has managed to hang on for so many years because of its ability to change with the times. From the Star Wars-esque fever dream of Moonraker to the media mogul frenzy of Tomorrow Never Dies, every Bond film delivers certain recognizable pleasures: style, danger, action, locations, memorable villains, music, gadgets, but each era reshapes those elements to reflect the anxieties and tastes of its times. The series constantly changes while still feeling unmistakably Bond. Today, I want to talk about the film that started my love for Bond, and that is For Your Eyes Only. I remember the first time I watched this movie. My dad, who is also a big fan of Bond, was watching this on a certain TV network. I can't remember what the network was, but it was back when we had cable. And I walked into his room right as the movie began. He told me that I should watch the movie with him, and that I would love it, and I did. After watching the whole film, I was deeply intrigued with what the Bond series was, so I bought the whole 50th anniversary Bond DVD collection, and watched every Bond film after that one chance encounter where I watched For Your Eyes Only. So without further ado, let's get into the movie. The movie revolves around a device known as ATAC.
Automatic Targeting Attack Communicator. Uses an ultra-low frequency coded transmitter to order our submarines to launch ballistic missiles.
The device was lost at sea after a ship that was equipped with ATAC, the St. George's, sunk in a location that is unknown to MI6. The British asks a marine archaeologist named Sir Thomas Havelock to go and look for the St. George's, but is killed along with his wife before he is able to discuss his findings. So Bond is sent in not just to solve the murder, but also to find the ATAC off the coast of Albania. Along the way, Bond meets the Havelock's daughter Melina, who is out for revenge after her parents were killed, and partners up with Bond to take down the villain. You know, the more I think about it, this movie is basically the same as Tomorrow Never Dies, as it has the exact same plot sequence where the government is trying to find a ship that they can't locate. This movie is also the first of 5 movies that John Glenn would direct for the Bond series, and the film was written by Bond staples Richard Maibaum, who wrote a total of 13 Bond films, and Michael G. Wilson, who is the stepson of Albert Broccoli, the former lead creative force behind all of the Bond films. And returning to the Bond role for the 5th time was Roger Moore, a Bond that many people I know don't seem to really enjoy, but I love Roger Moore. His charm and humor gives Bond a different kind of edge that the other Bonds don't have, but he also plays Bond in a very sophisticated and smart way where he doesn't come off as just the funny one. And I think that Carole Bouquet's performance as Melina is one of the best performances of any Bond girl in the franchise, even if she is dubbed. I know that there's a few people in this world that label Bond as sexist or misogynistic. I really don't think that's true. When you watch movies like For Your Eyes Only, you see women like Melina get propelled to a spot that almost equals Bond in a way, and I think that's true for a lot of the early Bond films. Maybe except Thunderball, but that is a different story. He also refuses to sleep with a woman who wants him to sleep with her, but he shows a great level of restraint in this movie, even though he later, in this movie, goes to a woman's house and seduces her to gain information on the character Columbo, but we'll get to him later. What struck me about this movie the first time I saw it was the opening action sequence. We get a brief little nod to On Her Majesty's Secret Service when Bond plants roses down on his wife's grave. We then get a scene where a man, supposedly longtime Bond villain Blofeld, takes over the helicopter that is carrying Bond and starts playing around with the helicopter. The scene is very tense because you're not sure what Blofeld is going to do with the helicopter. You know, the more I think about it, he could have just killed the pilot and have the helicopter go into the water and just let it crash. But hey, Bond might have survived it, and Blofeld wants to be fully sure that Bond is dead. But Bond is able to get the upper hand and kill Blofeld once and for all. What does this have to do with the story? Nothing. But it is basically an ending to a villain that many longtime Bond fans had either been waiting for or were very let down by how he was just killed off in such an uneventful way. The reason for his killing was made for legal circumstances. There was a legal battle between Eon Productions and producer Kevin McClory, who had the rights to the name Blofeld, so Eon couldn't just use the name directly, instead relying on audience knowledge to pinpoint that this person is Blofeld because he has the white cat. So to make it easier for Eon and Broccoli, they just killed off Blofeld. Now keep in mind, this was my first Bond film, so I didn't really care about that when I was 12, and I was just blown away by the helicopter sequence in general. It's funny reading about all the legal drama and watching all the other films to fully understand why this opening sequence happened. Another thing that really stood out to me while watching this film was the overall tone of the movie. Compared to older Bond films, this one feels much more grounded. It doesn't focus on over-the-top action or insane gadgets. Instead, Bond comes across as more human in this film, especially during the quieter moments where he is investigating clues or interacting with the Bond girls, rather than constantly jumping from one massive action set piece to another. Even the action scenes themselves feel more believable and tense because they rely more on physical danger than spectacle. This is especially surprising because the movie right before this was Moonraker, where Bond literally went to space. I mean, enough said. Since this was my first Bond film, I didn't really notice how much of a departure it was from the earlier films at the time, but after watching more entries in the series, I can appreciate how For Your Eyes Only intentionally scaled things back after the extravagance of Moonraker. And this is kind of necessary for the film because the studio making For Your Eyes Only, United Artists, was in a crisis when this movie came out. United Artists were the main production company behind Bond since the first one, Dr. No, in 1962, but in 1980 they suffered a horrific blow when they released a movie that bombed so bad that they never really recovered from it, and that was Heaven's Gate, a movie with a $44 million budget and only making back $3 million. So For Your Eyes Only had to strip back all of the big spectacle set pieces for a more grounded story. And this ties into one of the most memorable parts of the film for me, which is the setting and cinematography. Because For Your Eyes Only uses its locations in a way that makes the adventure feel much larger than it actually is. The Greek landscapes, snowy mountains, and underwater environments all give the movie a very distinct atmosphere that separates it from other Bond films. A lot of the action scenes feel more immersive because they are built around real locations rather than relying entirely on massive sets or special effects, possibly because of the lower budget. The climax at the monastery on top of the mountain is a perfect example of this because the setting itself creates tension before the action even begins. Watching Bond climb the cliff with barely anything to hold on to feels much more suspenseful than many of the bigger action scenes from other entries in the series. I think the film's grounded visual style helps reinforce its overall tone, making the world feel dangerous and believable while still maintaining the escapism that people expect from a Bond movie. The main villain in this movie is Aristotle Christados. He is trying to sell the ATAC to the Soviets for a massive amount of money. He is a manipulative businessman and smuggler who hides behind a respectable public image as an army veteran. That makes him dangerous in a different way because Bond spends much of the film trying to figure out who can actually be trusted. I also like how the movie plays with audience expectations through the rivalry between Christados and Milos Colombo, since the film initially presents Colombo as the suspicious figure before revealing that Christados is the real villain. It creates a more espionage-driven style of storytelling where deception matters just as much as physical action. Julian Glover gives Christados a calm and controlled presence that fits the tone of the film well because he feels less like a comic book villain and more like someone who could realistically exist within the world of international crime and politics. I also have to mention the other villain, Leopold Locke. He is what you would call a silent, totally sadistic hitman who, even though never talks throughout the entire movie, you can just tell through his movements and his looks that he is up to no good. Another aspect of the film that I found interesting was just how much more serious and emotionally restrained Bond feels compared to some of the previous movies. Roger Moore is often remembered for playing Bond in a much lighter and more comedic way, but in this film his performance feels much more focused and mature. There are still moments of humor, but they are balanced with scenes that show Bond as more cold, professional, and even tired at times. I think this change in characterization fits the grounded direction of the movie very well because it makes the world feel more believable. The villains are not trying to destroy the entire planet or build giant space weapons. They are motivated by greed and political advantage, which makes the conflict feel closer to a real espionage thriller. Looking back on the movie now, it almost feels like the filmmakers were trying to remind the audiences what made James Bond popular in the first place by scaling back the more over-the-top elements and emphasizing suspense, danger, and spy intrigue instead. Another part of For Your Eyes Only that I found interesting was how the movie handles revenge as one of its central themes. Unlike many Bond films where the mission is mainly about stopping the villain's grand scheme, this story feels much more personal for several of the characters. Melina Havelock is driven almost entirely by the murder of her parents, and throughout the film Bond constantly tries to stop her from letting revenge consume her. This creates an interesting contrast between the two characters because Bond is someone who has spent years surrounded by violence and understands how destructive revenge can become. The ending especially reinforces this theme when Bond prevents Melina from killing Christados in cold blood after everything is over. It is a surprisingly restrained moment for a Bond film because instead of ending with simple triumph, the movie pauses to show the emotional consequences of violence. And I also have to talk about the music of this movie, made by Bill Conti, because the music gives For Your Eyes Only a very unique identity compared to the other Bond films. The soundtrack is heavily influenced by early 1980s music trends, especially with its use of synthesizers and disco-inspired rhythms, which can make certain scenes feel very dated today. Now, as someone who was watching Bond for the first time, I didn't really care because I really liked the score as a whole, and the more I listened to it, the more I realized it actually fits the film's strange balance between seriousness and entertainment. Some tracks feel energetic and fun, while others create a surprisingly tense atmosphere during the action scenes. The title song performed by Sheena Easton is also memorable because it has a softer and more emotional tone than many Bond themes before it, which matches the film's more grounded approach. It is one of those scores that feels very tied to its era, but that also makes the movie more distinctive and memorable today. What makes For Your Eyes Only such a strong introduction to the Bond universe is how effortlessly it pulls the viewer into its world from the very beginning. Even if someone has never seen a Bond film before, the film immediately creates this feeling that there is a much larger history behind everything. The opening scene alone references Bond's past marriage, an old enemy, and long-running conflicts without fully explaining them, which makes the universe feel lived in and mysterious rather than simple and self-contained. At the same time, the movie still works perfectly fine for newcomers because the story is straightforward enough to follow without needing extensive knowledge of previous films. What really captivates first-time viewers, though, is the atmosphere of the Bond world itself. The locations, cinematography, tense action scenes, memorable music, and sense of international adventure create a type of escapism that feels uniquely Bond. Watching the film for the first time almost feels like being invited into a secret world of spies, danger, and sophistication, where every scene hints at decades of stories and mythology waiting to be explored. That is what makes someone curious enough to go back and watch the earlier films, because the movie makes the Bond universe feel much bigger than just the plot unfolding on screen. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and subscribe to Film513.